This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. When Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in July 2019 on federal charges, investigators were not starting from zero. For years, allegations, civil lawsuits, and earlier criminal proceedings had already created a substantial body of records connected to his activities. However, the 2019 case marked the beginning of a more focused federal investigation that aimed to examine the full scope of those allegations in detail. At the center of that effort was a simple objective: to gather and analyze evidence. Investigators sought documents, digital files, financial records, and witness testimony that could help establish what had occurred, where it had taken place, and who might have been involved. Because Epstein maintained multiple residences and a complex travel network, the investigation quickly expanded across several locations. These included properties in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Each location potentially contained materials relevant to the case. As a result, law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts to identify, secure, and review evidence from these sites. One of the key components of the investigation involved search warrants. Search warrants allow authorities to legally enter a property and collect items that may be connected to alleged criminal activity. These items can include computers, storage devices, documents, photographs, and other forms of physical or digital evidence. In Epstein's case, investigators executed searches at multiple properties. Reports indicated that agents collected large volumes of material, including electronic devices and records that required detailed forensic analysis. Digital evidence, in particular, can take significant time to process, as investigators must carefully examine files, communications, and metadata. At the same time, authorities worked to gather testimony. Witness interviews and depositions provided additional context, helping investigators understand how Epstein's network functioned and how different individuals and locations were connected. However, gathering evidence is only one part of the process. Equally important is determining what the evidence actually proves. Investigators must evaluate whether the materials they collect support specific allegations and whether they meet the legal standards required for prosecution. This distinction would become critical. Because while investigators were able to collect a substantial amount of information, not every question would ultimately be answered. Some records were incomplete, some evidence required interpretation, and some details remained beyond the reach of documentation. From the very beginning, the investigation was not only about what could be found, but also about what might remain unknown. As federal investigators expanded their case in 2019, one of their primary objectives was to collect and secure evidence from locations connected to Jeffrey Epstein. This process involved coordinated searches, forensic analysis, and the careful handling of both physical and digital materials. The types of evidence gathered were broad. At multiple properties, agents reportedly seized computers, hard drives, external storage devices, and other digital media. These items are often central in modern investigations because they can contain emails, documents, photographs, and metadata that help establish timelines and connections between individuals. Digital evidence, however, presents unique challenges. Files may be encrypted, deleted, or stored across multiple devices. Forensic specialists must use specialized tools to recover data, verify its authenticity, and determine when and how it was created or modified. This process can take months or even years, depending on the volume of material. In addition to digital files, investigators also examined paper records. These included financial documents, address books, calendars, and other written materials that could provide insight into Epstein's activities and contacts. Such records can be especially valuable because they sometimes reveal patterns of communication or travel that are not immediately visible in other forms of evidence. Another category of evidence involved photographs and video material. While details about specific findings were not fully disclosed to the public, authorities confirmed that visual media was among the types of evidence collected. As with digital files, this material required careful analysis to determine its relevance and context. Financial records also played a significant role. Investigators reviewed transactions, account activity, and transfers that could help trace how Epstein managed his assets and funded his operations. Financial data can reveal connections between individuals, organizations, and locations, making it a key component in complex investigations. At the same time, authorities gathered witness statements. Interviews with individuals connected to Epstein's network provided additional context for the physical and digital evidence. These accounts helped investigators understand how different pieces of information might fit together within a broader timeline. Yet even with large amounts of collected material, the process of interpretation remained complex. Not every document provides clear answers. Not every file is complete. And not every piece of evidence directly connects to a specific allegation. Investigators must evaluate each item carefully, determining what can be confirmed and what remains uncertain. This distinction between evidence collected and evidence proven is essential. Because while authorities were able to gather significant amounts of material, the question remained: how much of it could actually be used to build a case? Once investigators collected large volumes of material from Jeffrey Epstein's properties, the next phase began: analysis. This stage is often less visible to the public but is one of the most critical parts of any complex investigation. The sheer amount of data presented an immediate challenge. Digital devices alone can contain thousands, or even millions, of files. Emails, documents, images, and system records must all be reviewed, categorized, and verified. Investigators rely on forensic software to organize this information, identify relevant content, and detect patterns within large datasets. One of the primary goals of analysis is to establish timelines. By examining timestamps, communication records, and travel data, investigators attempt to reconstruct sequences of events. For example, a digital message might be compared with a flight record or a financial transaction to determine whether multiple sources align. When different types of evidence point to the same time and place, they can strengthen a finding. Another key objective is identifying connections between individuals. Address books, contact lists, and communication records can reveal networks of association. These connections do not necessarily indicate wrongdoing, but they help investigators understand how people were linked and how information or activity may have moved through that network. Financial data is also analyzed in this way. Transactions can be traced to identify patterns, recurring payments, or relationships between accounts. When combined with other evidence, financial records can provide insight into how operations were structured and maintained. However, analysis is not simply about finding information, it is also about verifying it. Investigators must determine whether data is authentic, whether it has been altered, and whether it can be reliably connected to specific events. Digital evidence, in particular, requires careful validation to ensure that conclusions are based on accurate information. Despite these tools and methods, limitations remain. Not all data is recoverable. Some records may be incomplete or missing, and certain activities may leave little or no digital trace. These gaps can make it difficult to form a complete picture, even when large amounts of material are available. Another important factor is interpretation. A document or file may appear significant, but without context, its meaning can be unclear. Investigators must compare multiple sources to understand how each piece of evidence fits into the broader timeline. This process takes time, and often raises as many questions as it answers. Because while analysis can reveal patterns and connections, it cannot always explain the full context behind them. And that distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation progressed. As investigators analyzed the material collected from Jeffrey Epstein's properties, certain elements began to move from possibility to confirmation. This transition, from raw data to verified findings, is a critical step in any legal investigation. Confirmed findings are based on corroborated evidence. This means that multiple sources, such as digital records, financial data, and witness testimony, align in a way that supports a consistent conclusion. When different types of evidence point to the same sequence of events, investigators gain greater confidence in their accuracy. In Epstein's case, some patterns became clear. Travel records confirmed frequent movement between his residences in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Financial documents demonstrated the scale of his resources and the complexity of his financial operations. Communication records, where available, showed ongoing contact between Epstein and various individuals within his network. These elements helped establish a framework of activity. Investigators could map where Epstein traveled, how often those trips occurred, and how his properties were connected within a broader system. This framework did not answer every question, but it provided a structured understanding of his movements and interactions. Certain physical and digital materials also contributed to confirmed findings. Items recovered during searches, when verified and placed within a timeline, helped support aspects of the investigation. Combined with witness testimony, these materials allowed authorities to form conclusions about specific patterns of behavior. However, confirmation does not mean completeness. Even when evidence supports a particular finding, it may only represent part of a larger picture. Investigators often work with fragments, pieces of information that reveal certain details while leaving others unresolved. Another important factor is legal standards. For a finding to be used in court, it must meet strict requirements regarding authenticity, relevance, and reliability. Evidence that appears significant during an investigation may not always meet those standards when subjected to legal scrutiny. This distinction affects how much of the collected material can ultimately be presented as proof. In Epstein's case, the investigation was still developing when it was interrupted. As a result, some findings were confirmed at an investigative level but were never fully tested in a courtroom setting. This left a gap between what investigators believed they could establish and what could be formally proven through trial. Understanding that gap is essential. Because alongside what was confirmed, there were also significant areas where the evidence remained unclear, incomplete, or unavailable. While investigators were able to verify certain patterns through documents, digital evidence, and testimony, there were also significant gaps in what could be conclusively established. These gaps are a common feature of complex investigations, particularly when they involve private networks, international travel, and events that span many years. One of the main challenges was incomplete records. Not every interaction leaves a documented trace. Private meetings, informal arrangements, and travel by non-commercial means often produce little or no official record. In Epstein's case, many movements between properties, especially those involving private aircraft and boats, were only partially documented. This meant that some timelines could not be fully reconstructed. Even when flight logs showed travel to a particular location, they did not always confirm what happened afterward. A passenger arriving in the U.S. Virgin Islands, for example, might have gone to multiple destinations, and the final leg of the journey often left no clear record. Another limitation involved missing or unavailable data. Digital evidence can be lost for many reasons. Devices may be replaced, files may be deleted, and storage media may degrade over time. Although forensic tools can sometimes recover deleted information, recovery is not always complete. As a result, investigators may only see part of the original dataset. Witness testimony also introduced uncertainty. While sworn statements are an important part of legal proceedings, different witnesses may recall events differently. Some accounts may lack precise dates or details, making it difficult to match them with other records such as travel logs or financial transactions. In addition, not every individual connected to Epstein's network was identified through available documents. Address books, contact lists, and communication records can reveal many connections, but they do not necessarily capture every interaction. Some relationships may have existed outside documented channels, leaving them largely invisible to investigators. Legal limitations also played a role. Certain types of evidence may not meet the standards required for use in court, even if they appear relevant during an investigation. Other materials may be subject to privacy protections or ongoing legal restrictions, limiting how much information can be publicly disclosed. These factors combined to create areas where investigators could not reach definitive conclusions. Questions about specific visits, timelines, or interactions sometimes remained unresolved, not because they were ignored, but because the available evidence was insufficient to support a clear finding. Understanding these limitations is essential when evaluating the case. The absence of confirmation does not necessarily mean that something did or did not happen. It simply reflects the boundaries of what can be established through documented evidence. And those boundaries would become even more significant as the investigation moved forward. As investigators moved from analysis to legal strategy, they faced a central challenge. How to build a case using evidence that was substantial, yet incomplete. This is a common issue in complex investigations, where large volumes of data exist, but not all of it meets the standards required for prosecution. Prosecutors must make careful decisions about which evidence to use. Not every document, file, or testimony collected during an investigation can be presented in court. Each piece must meet legal criteria, including authenticity, relevance, and reliability. Evidence that cannot be verified or clearly connected to specific events may be excluded. This process is known as evidentiary selection. In Epstein's case, prosecutors focused on materials that could be clearly supported by multiple sources. For example, a travel record might be paired with witness testimony and financial data to establish a consistent narrative. When different forms of evidence align, they strengthen the overall case. At the same time, prosecutors must consider clarity. A case presented in court must be understandable to a judge or jury. Complex datasets, fragmented timelines, or ambiguous records can weaken the effectiveness of an argument, even if they contain potentially important details. For this reason, legal teams often prioritize coherent sequences of events over isolated pieces of information. Another important factor is legal risk. Introducing uncertain or weak evidence can create opportunities for the defense to challenge the case. If a piece of evidence is successfully disputed, it may undermine related findings or reduce the credibility of the broader argument. As a result, prosecutors tend to rely on evidence that is both strong and clearly documented. However, this approach has consequences. By focusing only on what can be proven to a legal standard, parts of the broader picture may remain outside the courtroom. Information that is suggestive but not conclusive may be left unaddressed in formal proceedings. This creates a distinction between investigative knowledge and legal proof. Investigators may be aware of patterns or connections that cannot be fully demonstrated in court. These insights can guide the direction of an investigation, but they do not always translate into prosecutable claims. In Epstein's case, this distinction was particularly significant. Because the investigation involved multiple locations, numerous individuals, and a long timeline, not all elements could be consolidated into a single, clear legal narrative. Despite these challenges, authorities continued to refine their approach, identifying the strongest available evidence and preparing it for potential legal action. But before that process could fully unfold, the case took an unexpected turn, one that would fundamentally affect how the evidence was used and understood. As prosecutors and investigators continued organizing evidence and refining their case, the legal process was suddenly interrupted. In August 2019, Jeffrey Epstein died while in federal custody. His death brought an immediate halt to the criminal proceedings against him, preventing the case from moving forward to trial. This development had a significant impact on how the collected evidence would be used. In a typical prosecution, evidence is presented in court, challenged by the defense, and evaluated through a formal legal process. Witnesses testify, documents are scrutinized, and findings are tested under strict procedural standards. Without a trial, that process did not occur. As a result, much of the evidence gathered during the investigation was never fully examined in a courtroom setting. While investigators had collected and analyzed substantial material, the absence of a trial meant there was no final legal determination based on that evidence. This created a gap between what was investigated and what was formally established in court. For prosecutors, the case could no longer proceed in its original form. Criminal charges against Epstein were effectively closed, and the focus shifted to other legal avenues, including ongoing investigations into related individuals and separate civil cases. However, even as the criminal case ended, the evidence itself did not disappear. Documents, digital files, and witness statements remained part of investigative records. Some of this material would later surface in civil litigation, court filings, and publicly released documents, offering partial insight into what investigators had uncovered. Still, without the structure of a trial, these materials were often presented in fragments. Individual records might appear in isolation, without the full context that a courtroom process is designed to provide. This made it more difficult to form a complete and universally accepted understanding of the case. Another consequence was the absence of cross-examination. In a trial, evidence is tested through questioning and opposing arguments. This process helps clarify uncertainties and challenge inconsistencies. Without it, many pieces of evidence remained untested in a formal legal sense. For investigators, this meant that some conclusions remained at the level of investigative findings, rather than judicial determinations. The interruption also influenced public perception. With no trial to present a comprehensive narrative, information about the case continued to emerge through documents, reports, and secondary sources. This contributed to ongoing questions about what was known, what could be proven, and what remained unresolved. Understanding this turning point is essential. Because from this moment forward, the story of the evidence would no longer be shaped by a single courtroom proceeding, but by a series of separate disclosures, interpretations, and legal processes. After the criminal case against Jeffrey Epstein came to an abrupt end, attention shifted toward civil litigation and the gradual release of documents. These processes became the primary way in which information from the investigation entered the public domain. Civil cases operate under different rules than criminal trials. While they still require evidence and testimony, the standard of proof is lower. Instead of proving guilt, beyond a reasonable doubt, civil proceedings typically rely on a preponderance of evidence, meaning that a claim is more likely true than not. This distinction allowed certain materials to be introduced and examined in ways that might not have occurred in a criminal courtroom. One of the key features of civil litigation is document disclosure. As part of legal proceedings, parties may be required to produce emails, records, and other materials relevant to the case. Over time, this process led to the release of documents connected to Epstein's network, including depositions, correspondence, and internal records. These materials provided additional context to the investigation. They offered glimpses into relationships, timelines, and communications that had previously been part of sealed or limited access files. In some instances, documents helped clarify details that were only partially understood during the initial investigation. However, these releases were often fragmented. Documents became public in stages, sometimes years apart, and not always as part of a single, cohesive narrative. A deposition might surface independently of related emails, or a set of records might be released without accompanying context. This piecemeal nature made interpretation more complex. Readers and analysts had to piece together information from multiple sources, often without the benefit of a structured legal presentation. As a result, different interpretations of the same material could emerge. Another important aspect was redaction. Many documents were partially withheld or edited to protect privacy, comply with court orders, or address ongoing legal considerations. Names, dates, or specific details were sometimes removed, limiting how much could be directly confirmed from the released material. Even so, civil cases contributed significantly to public understanding. They brought forward witness testimony, revealed certain patterns of interaction, and provided insight into how individuals described their experiences. These accounts, when combined with previously known evidence, expanded the overall picture of the case. Yet, like the original investigation, these disclosures also had limits. Not all documents were released, not all questions were answered, and not all connections could be fully verified. This meant that while civil litigation added important pieces to the puzzle, it did not produce a complete or final account. Instead, it reinforced a central theme: the difference between available information and definitive conclusions. As documents from civil cases and investigative records gradually became public, the role of the media became increasingly significant. Journalists, analysts, and independent researchers began examining the available material, translating complex legal and investigative findings into narratives accessible to a wider audience. Media coverage served an important function, bringing visibility to information that might otherwise remain buried in legal filings or technical reports. Through articles, documentaries, and interviews, details from depositions, flight records, and financial documents were presented in a more structured and digestible form. This helped shape public awareness and ensured that the case remained part of ongoing discussion. However, media interpretation also introduced new challenges. Unlike a courtroom, where evidence is presented under strict rules and procedures, media reporting operates with greater flexibility. Journalists must interpret documents, select which details to highlight, and construct narratives based on available information. This process can lead to variations in emphasis. Different outlets may focus on different aspects of the same material. One report might highlight travel records, while another concentrates on witness testimony or financial connections. As a result, the overall picture can appear fragmented or inconsistent depending on the source. Another factor is context. Documents released through legal processes are often complex and highly specific. Without full context, certain details may be misunderstood or interpreted in ways that go beyond what the evidence can definitively support. For example, the appearance of a name in a document may indicate a form of association, but it does not necessarily establish the nature or extent of that relationship. This distinction is critical, yet it can be difficult to maintain in public discourse. Media coverage also interacts with public perception. As information spreads, it is discussed, analyzed, and sometimes reshaped through commentary, social platforms, and secondary reporting. Over time, this can blur the line between verified information and interpretation or speculation. In high-profile cases, this effect is amplified. The volume of available material, combined with strong public interest, can lead to rapid conclusions that are not always fully supported by confirmed evidence. Once established, these narratives can be difficult to correct or refine. At the same time, investigative journalism has played a key role in uncovering and clarifying information. Persistent reporting has led to the discovery of new documents, the identification of previously overlooked details, and increased pressure for transparency. In many instances, media efforts have complemented formal investigations by continuing to examine the case after official proceedings slowed or ended. This dual role, both informative and interpretive, makes media coverage a powerful influence on how the case is understood. It provides access to information, but also shapes how that information is perceived. And as the narrative continued to evolve, one final question remained. What does all of this evidence, confirmed findings, missing pieces, document releases, and public interpretation, ultimately tell us? After years of investigations, document releases, civil cases, and extensive media coverage, the Epstein case presents a complex and layered body of information. Across all these sources, one central question remains. What can actually be concluded from the available evidence? First, it is clear that investigators were able to establish consistent patterns. Travel records, financial data, and witness testimony collectively confirmed that Epstein maintained a network of residences and movements across multiple locations. These patterns were not isolated, they formed a structured system that investigators could map and analyze. Second, the evidence demonstrates the existence of documented associations. Records such as contact lists, flight logs, and correspondence show that Epstein interacted with a wide range of individuals. These connections were real and verifiable at the level of documentation. However, the nature and extent of many of these associations remain unclear. Being named in a record does not, by itself, define the context of a relationship. This distinction is one of the most important, and most frequently misunderstood, aspects of the case. Third, the investigation revealed both confirmed findings and unresolved gaps. Some elements were supported by multiple forms of evidence and could be established with confidence. Others remained incomplete due to missing records, limited data, or the inability to verify specific details. These gaps are not unusual in complex investigations, but in this case, they carry particular significance. Because the legal process was interrupted, much of the evidence was never fully tested in court. This means there is no single, definitive legal narrative that brings all elements together under one formal conclusion. Instead, the case exists as a combination of investigative conclusions, civil disclosures, and public interpretation. Each of these layers contributes to understanding, but none provides a complete picture on its own. Another key takeaway is the importance of evidentiary limits. What investigators can suspect, infer, or consider likely is not the same as what they can prove to a legal standard. This boundary defines how conclusions are formed and how they should be interpreted. In Epstein's case, that boundary remains highly visible. The available records show a network, a pattern of activity, and a body of evidence that is substantial. At the same time, they leave unanswered questions that may never be fully resolved due to missing information and the absence of a completed trial. Ultimately, the case illustrates a broader reality. Evidence can reveal structure, patterns, and connections, but it does not always deliver complete certainty. What remains is an evolving understanding shaped by documented facts, legal limitations, and continued examination. And as more information emerges over time, that understanding may continue to develop, though some aspects of the case may always remain beyond full confirmation. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public, and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.